What's the creepiest thing you've seen in the woods, mountains, deserts, or any other remote places? I was out on the coast in the Pacific Northwest. You drive west through the mountains, hit the coast, and Highway 101 runs north and south through an incredible mix of habitats. One moment you're on sea cliffs, the next near tidal pools, then in coastal pines with ferns the size of small cars. There are places that get swallowed by the Pacific during storms, with little ecosystems growing inside fallen trees, showing the constant fight for high ground. Emerald groves dotted with amanita mushrooms look like rubies and gold nuggets against reddish-brown pine needles. For the most part, you're safe out there. Staying aware of your surroundings and using a walking stick can keep you from serious injury. There are big cats, bears, elk, and moose, but if you're careful and paying attention, you're usually fine. Every now and then, new large cat warning signs go up, or fresh no poaching signs appear. If you spend enough time out there, you'll also find meth labs and makeshift camps, which are honestly the most dangerous things you'll encounter. It was early in the season, and I was on a spit that usually gets battered by waves and disappears during winter storms. Part of it was engineered for flooding, and the main path had small hills on either side, turning it into a kind of massive game trail that floods first. Wildlife usually stayed near the open end by the sea, and occasionally a big cat would chase a deer, make a kill, and drag it off to the side. You'd sometimes see signs of struggle, but more often just remains off the path. I know this area well. The sea and I are familiar with each other, but this one night was different. It was getting dark, and I was standing in the open wildlife area, realizing I needed to head back to my car. I checked my flashlights, but I'd burned through them 12 to 16 hours earlier before dawn. I checked the steady lights of 2 landmarks, triangulated my position, and tucked that information away. I figured if I couldn't make it back in the dark, I didn't belong out there at that hour. I started walking back at a steady pace, not running, not acting like prey. Still, something felt wrong. I texted my wife, telling her I was okay, just a little shaken, and that I'd be back at my car when I got signal again in about 60 minutes. The faint glow of my phone was the last light I had. I felt like I was being followed. I told myself it was nerves. I heard twigs snapping and rustling, normal sounds of animals settling in for the night. I thought I heard whispers, but convinced myself it was just wind, waves, and wildlife. I reached for my phone again, realized it would give me away, and put it down. I walked another 20 feet and heard it again. It wasn't a bear or elk, and if it were a big cat, I wouldn't hear it at all. It wasn't a deer either. The sound was a sharp snap, more like a thock, and whatever caused it wasn't small. I started thinking it had to be a person. Someone had seen me and wanted my gear, my money, or worse. As I reached the final half mile, I figured an animal would have attacked by now if that's what it was. I saw the faint outline of the parking lot in the moonlight. I spun around thinking I'd rather face it than be ambushed. I shined my phone down the dark corridor of trees flanking the path. Nothing. I felt a brief wave of relief. Then another snap came from behind me. Whatever it was had moved around me and was close. A deer bolted through the sedge. I heard more snapping, shuffling, and branches catching on clothing. That's when it hit me. They were trying to intercept me before I reached the car. I moved off the expected path, cutting through sedge and wild berries, then looped back toward the parking lot. I hadn't seen a single person all day, even though several cars were parked there. I reached my car, fumbled the keys, started it before I was fully seated, and sped off. Behind me, in the light from the restrooms and the moon, were 7 or 8 men. Some ran after the car before slowing down. I saw faint silver flashes, blades in a few of their hands, including one machete. The others carried sticks or blunt objects. I don't know what they wanted, but they wanted it badly. I've hiked there for years. I won't be going back. Story 2. My boyfriend and I were backpacking through rural Tasmania a few years ago. While on a bus, we were discussing our plans for the following 2 weeks, when the girl sitting in front of us turned around and offered us a place to stay in her town. We declined since we were heading elsewhere first, but she gave us her mobile number and said she and her partner would love to host us. A few days later, we decided to take them up on the offer. We called her, and she said they were happy to have us. So far, so good. They met us at the train station, and immediately something felt off. It's hard to explain, but it was that primal feeling in your gut that tells you something isn't right. We ignored it and followed them anyway. They led us straight out of town. When we asked where we were going, they said they lived on the outskirts. The town itself was creepy as heck, an old mining town that had mostly been abandoned. As we walked the 15 or so minutes to their home, the houses got worse. Boarded up windows, overgrown gardens, and not a single person in sight. Eventually, we reached the very last house in town. It was theirs. Inside, there was a single mattress set up in the middle of the living room with a sheet hanging around it. They showed us the rest of the house except for one door, which stayed closed. When I asked what was behind it, they pretended not to hear me. Our room, meanwhile, had a proper bed and looked completely normal, which made it even stranger that they slept on mattresses in the living room. Back in the living room, we noticed knives. A lot of knives. My boyfriend asked if they went hunting. They said no. The partner handed my boyfriend one of the knives and asked him to open it. It was a massive Bowie knife with what looked like blood staining along the edge. My boyfriend laughed awkwardly and put it down. They also had a tattoo gun to practice. Neither of them had tattoos. There was a small axe by the door. They didn't collect wood. Suddenly, the guy said he wanted to go to the shops. We agreed quickly, eager to get back into town. The four of us left, but they started walking in the opposite direction. I pointed out that town was the other way. He said this route would be more interesting because it went up through the trees and claimed it would take the same amount of time. I told my boyfriend I was freaking out, but he thought it was probably fine. We followed them anyway. The path went uphill, directly away from town. At one point, the girl turned to her partner and whispered, "So where was the place again?" We froze. I said I wanted to take the road back to town and started walking. When we finally reached the only shop in town, no one recognized the couple, which was unsettling given how small the town was. We made an excuse about wanting to see some sights and said we'd catch up later. Instead, we booked a hotel room and panicked. Later, I looked into the area. Their house had an extra room behind the closed door and a basement. The path they had taken us on led straight out of town and up the mountain. There was no way it looped back, so yeah, I'm pretty sure we narrowly avoided being murdered. Or maybe they were just extremely weird. Honestly, the creepiest part was that there were no drugs involved. If they'd been intoxicated, their behavior might have made more sense. But they weren't. Story 3. I grew up in a small town in a fairly rural area. A few years after the fact, I became fairly certain it was a skinwalker, about 10. Years ago, I was staying at my dad's house for the weekend in Kentucky. People in Appalachia are very superstitious, descended from Scots-Irish settlers who never really lost that mindset. My dad wasn't superstitious, at least not that I knew, and he wasn't easily scared. It was around 10 at night when we randomly decided to go into town to get McDonald's. My dad always insisted on walking in front of me. I assumed it was so I wouldn't accidentally step on a snake, but now I'm not so sure. He turned on the porch light and opened the screen door. As soon as he put one foot onto the porch, there was this god-awful sound. I will never forget it. It was a screech followed by the sound of a crow. But it wasn't a crow. The best way I can describe it is a person trying to mimic a crow call. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my dad immediately retreated into the house. He slammed the door and locked it, something I had never seen him do. Before I could ask any questions, he said, "It isn't safe. We can go tomorrow morning." And that's what we did. For the rest of the night, we stayed inside. My dad didn't even go outside to smoke a cigarette, and he let the outside dogs stay in the house. We never talked about it again, but it remains one of the scariest moments of my life. Story 4. This was quite a few years ago. My friend Levi and I had this really cool spot to hang out in the woods. You had to walk in the middle of a creek for about 1 kilometer and duck through sharp bushes and thistles. The hike was well worth it. The spot itself was about half an acre, with pure green grass on an incline and beautiful clear water ponds everywhere. There was tons of wildlife, and butterflies lived there, so there were always plenty fluttering around. The story begins on the way to this place. Levi and I were walking along the river in the valley. Nobody else ever went down there. Suddenly, Levi stopped and ducked into a bush. I did the same, thinking there must have been a large animal. I saw him staring up the hill, so I looked up too. There were 2 people at the top, tossing a lifeless body back and forth. We watched as they threw the corpse down the hill. It bounced off trees and eventually got stuck in a tree at the bottom. Then they ran off. We were terrified. I was shaking so badly I couldn't speak. We decided to check if it was real, Levi got about 4 feet away before screaming, "It has nostrils! It's real! Run!" Of course, we ran. I glanced back to see the 2 people running back to the top of the hill. We ran about 2 kilometers through thick brush and trees to get away. The next day we were with his parents driving to town when we saw about 10 fire trucks at the school closest to the forest. Terrified, we told his parents, crying and worried, that we were going to get murdered. His mom started laughing and said they were training for search and rescue. That was a dummy the firemen had to find. I never slept as well as I did that day. Story 5. My girlfriend and I were hiking along some abandoned railroad tracks when we reached a small bridge over a little creek. I was about to go explore under the bridge when she pointed something out. I looked over and saw a guy standing in the woods across from us. I shrugged it off and kept heading down toward the creek. Then the guy stood up, and I realized he was wearing nothing. We immediately backtracked as fast as we could to get away. When we were about 1 minute down the trail, I looked back and saw the naked guy standing in the middle of the path, just watching us walk away. Story 6. I was in a large wooded area near my boyfriend's home with him, hanging out nearly at midnight. We had gone in pretty deep, which required a good amount of climbing. The closest path was maybe 5 to 7 minutes climb down, so it was highly unlikely anyone could be at that spot at that time of night besides us. As we were kissing, he thought he saw a shadow move about 20 to 25 feet to the left of us, climbing, but it stopped suddenly when he looked at it. He told me to be wary, and at that exact moment, we saw a dark figure climbing a little up, but diagonally, like it was trying to get directly above where we were. We didn't move and watched it until it closed the horizontal gap and was directly above us, maybe 15 feet up on the steep downhill thick forest. Then it began coming toward us. Without hesitation, my boyfriend grabbed my hand, and we almost ran downhill to the path. We made it in less than 2 minutes while still holding hands, listening to the man running behind us. We ran as fast as we could down the path and out of the forest, to where there was a cafe and some basketball and tennis courts next to the wooded hill, and of course, people. Realizing how close we came to being mugged or worse, we vowed never to go there at night again. Story 7. It was dark, and I was sitting around a bonfire with 4 friends in rural North Carolina. We had been drinking, and they had smoked a bit. I wasn't at the time, taking turns telling stories. A lull came in the conversation, and the black silhouette of a 6th person stood up and faded into the surrounding darkness. We decided we'd had enough for the night, packed everything up, and walked back to a friend's house. All 5 of us swear there was a 6th person there, but we don't remember any discernible characteristics, just that they seemed to be covered in shadow. Story 8. I come from a village high in the mountains of the Karakoram Range. Many people know of Abbottabad as the last hiding place of Osama bin Laden. My village is about 40 miles north of there, as the crow flies. By road, it is almost a 2-hour drive through mountain roads, followed by a mountain trail. The last part of the journey must be done on foot, as the village sits on a steep mountainside. I grew up there, and my childhood and adolescence were spent in the jungle, surrounding the village and in the mountain streams. There were local lore and legends about the forest, and they were universally believed. When I was about 19 and studying at a college in Abbottabad, a few of my friends decided to spend several days trekking through the mountains. We were especially interested in exploring a cave where, according to legend, a mountain spring simply disappeared. It was said that if you were lucky enough to go very deep into the cave, there was a gold mine, with sand full of gold carried by the stream. However, the place was said to be guarded by jinns. We gathered at my home. 3 were classmates from the city, and 4 more joined us from my village. Including myself, we were a group of 8 young men. This was in 1973. We had no maps, only a general knowledge of the area and its landmarks. Except for the 3 city boys, we all knew how to move through the jungle and walk in the mountains. We walked, slept in the open, fished, ate wild fruits and dried food from home, and talked as we trekked. The ascent was steep and seemed endless, with jungle all around. About a week later, we entered an area none of us had visited before. There were rocks, boulders, small springs, and streams, and the trees were less dense. We believed the cave with the disappearing stream had to be somewhere nearby. That night, exhausted after a very hard climb, we ate, laid out our canvas sheets, and fell asleep quickly. I do not know how long we slept. I was awakened when I felt someone brushing my hair. As I turned and was about to ask what it was, a hand covered my mouth and someone whispered my name, telling me to be quiet and to wake the others the same way without making a sound. Before I could ask why, I heard the sound of a woman giggling, followed by a low humming noise. We woke one another, and soon all of us were awake. We could hear a woman laughing around us, and then, heavy footsteps in the distance. Something very heavy was walking slowly toward us. I had a torch and turned it on. We saw only trees, boulders, and rocks. Everything was quiet. Fearing the batteries would run out, I turned it off. We huddled together, packed our sheets, put on our shoes, and sat in silence. It was a moonless night, and clouds blocked the starlight. We could still hear the woman laughing and the heavy footsteps moving around us. Finally, my patience ran out. I was young and foolish. I said aloud that I would not sit there like a chicken waiting for the knife, and that we should see what this thing was. To my surprise, everyone agreed. We decided to speak louder, and if we had to move, to stay very close together in pairs. Someone shouted, asking who they were, and telling them to show themselves. Within seconds, we could sense that many beings were around us. We turned on our lights and saw at least 10 to 12 figures surrounding us. They were not monkeys, though. There are many in those mountains. They were not human, but human-like. Hairy, broad, about 6.5 to 7 feet tall, but not like gorillas. Their faces were round to elongated, and they were covered in dark hair. Someone said the air smelled strange. Another said it must be their smell. It was not unpleasant, just different. Then we noticed something else. The forest was completely silent. All the usual night sounds, insects, birds, animals, even the wind, had stopped. It was unnaturally quiet. When I turned my torch on again, the figures were gone. Still, we all knew we were being watched. We could feel it. Another friend took the torch and swept it around. On a large boulder about 20 feet away stood a giant figure, much taller than the rest, around 7 to 8 feet tall, staring at us. Panic set in. The still air, the silence, the darkness, and our belief in jinns all weighed on us. Someone warned us not to run, saying that if we did, we would all be harmed. We were told to stick together and recite verses from the Quran. One of us spoke aloud, saying we had come in peace and meant no harm. Then we heard a giggle, and a woman approached. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, dressed like a wealthy woman from the area, with long hair and very fair skin. She spoke softly and told us not to go any further, and that we must return. Then she disappeared into the night. At that moment, the jungle came back to life. The sounds of insects, animals, birds, and the wind returned. The strange beings were gone. We waited until daybreak and then left. Now I am 65 years old and a grandfather. I have seen many places since then. I do not know what we encountered that night, and I never returned to that area. Story 9. Just outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, there's an old abandoned medical center that used to treat people with polio. As high schoolers, we would go there at night, mostly because it was creepy and we were bored. I probably went there about 15 times over the course of 4 years. It was always unsettling, but the only time I ever completely noped out was when I walked into one of the rooms and found a mattress on a bed frame. Newish, which was strange since there were many bed frames but never mattresses, as the place had been abandoned long ago. In the middle of the room was a circle drawn on the floor, with naked dolls sitting around it and a candle in the center, unlit. On the wall, in huge letters, was written, "Play with me, children," along with a few other things that freaked us out. I'm 90% sure there was more writing saying something like, "If I'm not here when you arrive, wait for me," though that might be a false memory. If it was an attempt by the landowner to stop kids from trespassing, it worked. To this day, I think we accidentally stumbled upon a crazy person's new living area. I never went back after that. Story 10. I'm a long-haul truck driver, and I used to run from the Midwest to the West Coast. On my way back to the Midwest from Los Angeles, I would usually drive at night. It was easier that way, with less traffic. About 6 or 7 hours into one of those trips, somewhere in Utah, I can't remember the city, I was on Interstate 15, getting onto Interstate 70 and heading toward the Rockies. If you've ever traveled out there by car, bus, or train, you know how clearly you can see the night sky and almost all of its stars. I passed my favorite truck stop for a quick lunch. Not long after, my XM radio started going haywire, even though it had just been professionally installed. I remember thinking, great, I got ripped off. Then I looked up and saw a light in the sky. I thought to myself that I didn't know where that plane could be going, since I'd been up and down those roads for a while. I even wondered if they had built a new airport in that direction. As I kept driving, I realized I was coming up on an area that was completely empty and isolated, with nothing for hundreds of miles in any direction, and I could still see the light. I looked at the clock and realized I had driven 3 hours since my last stop, but I only remembered about 2 of them. I pulled off the interstate and checked my dash cam. Everything from when I stopped to when I pulled over was recorded. When I looked up again, the light had stopped moving and was just hovering over me. I jumped back into my truck, made a U-turn on the highway, and raced back to my favorite truck stop. I called my dispatcher and told him, "Forget Trader Joe's and the food. I'm not moving until I see sunlight." Then I hung up, locked my doors, shut my curtains, and went to bed. The next morning, I checked myself, my truck, and everything on it, even the fuel. I found nothing wrong and nothing new. To this day, I refuse to go past the Rockies. I've told my dispatcher to take the tip of Nebraska on the west side and draw a line straight north. To south. That's my cutoff. I still can't remember that one missing hour, and that light followed me almost all the way back to the truck stop. I lost sight of it about 5 miles before I pulled in for the night. All of this happened about 3 years ago. At the time, I was 22. I'm 25 now. Story 11, I was deployed on a warship in 2016. At that point, we were entering the Philippine Sea. The weather had been foul, with storms and heavy seas, but they usually stayed far enough away that you could watch lightning strike the salt water. Each strike lit everything up in an ethereal, glowing green. I was outside watching the storm when I heard the faint sound of bells, like naval bells, ringing. It sounded muted, almost as if it were underwater. 4 bells rang like this. Ding, 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 ding. A few minutes later, I heard them again. 4 bells are rung for a captain whenever he steps aboard a ship. The only thought I had was that there must have been some forgotten wreck beneath us, and the dead were still keeping the traditions alive as we sailed over them. Story 12. This happened 7 years ago. I was living in a rented house with 2 bathrooms. One of them was broken and unusable, and it smelled terrible whenever you opened the door. I always kept that bathroom bolted and locked. One night, a thunderstorm was moving into the city. The power went out because the winds were so strong. I was sitting alone in the living room when I heard a thudding sound coming from the bathroom. I assumed it was just air pressure changes from the storm and went back to working on my assignments. Then there was a loud thud, and I swear I saw the bathroom door open. I completely freaked out, ran out of the house, and stayed on the terrace until the power came back. I have no idea where the lock went or how the door opened. When I finally went back inside, the door was partly closed. I locked it again and even tied it shut with a rope. I moved out of that house within a couple of weeks and never went near it again. Edit. There was nothing visibly creepy, just the situation itself scared the hell out of me. Story 13. In southwest Georgia, deep in the hardwoods about 8 miles outside the town of Attapulgis, I had a pretty disturbing encounter. I was around 16 years old, about 5 years ago. My dad and I went hunting, and we always climbed different trees anywhere from 1 mile to 4 miles apart. The idea was that if one of us startled a deer, it might wander toward the other hunter. As I was climbing a tree with my tree stand, I heard something below me, about 12 feet down and roughly 30 yards out. It sounded like twigs cracking. I stopped and looked, but all I saw was dense woods. I figured it was a small animal, maybe a squirrel. About half an hour later, I was settled into my tree. The sun was starting to peek through the leaves, and it was fully morning. As I sat there, I noticed a palmetto bush. Normally that wouldn't be strange, but the fact that it caught my attention bothered me. I couldn't figure out why. I stared at it for a while, confused. It was just a normal palmetto bush. I kept scanning the area, but hours passed and I kept noticing that same bush. I couldn't understand why it stood out so much. Around 11 in the morning, my dad paged me and said he wanted to meet at what we called the honey hole, a good hunting spot with a small stream, plenty of cover, and good access. I agreed and started packing up. That's when I heard twigs snapping again, coming from the bush. I looked closer and finally realized what was wrong. There was a man staring at me through the palmetto. He had a scraggly beard, a tan coat, and what looked like work pants. He had a hood on that matched the color of the bush, and his face was covered in mud, like hunting camouflage. I grabbed my Remington 700 and pointed it toward the ground near him. As soon as I did, he let out a terrifying cackle and took off toward a creek about 150 yards away. I watched him through my scope the whole time, hearing him laugh as he ran. The scariest part was when he leapt across the creek in a single jump. It was about 9 feet wide, maybe 5 or 6 at the narrowest point, but still unbelievable. I wasn't as scared as I was disturbed. I had a rifle and trusted my equipment and my aim. I didn't shoot because it was public hunting land. I climbed down and met my dad at the honey hole, where I told him everything. We kept hunting that area afterward and never saw the man again. We reported it to the club, but no one had heard of anything like it. About 3 months later, though, someone else reported seeing a man matching the same description. They said they were in a tree stand at dawn when they noticed something at eye level. The man was in a nearby tree, hanging upside down like a sloth, staring at them from about 20 feet up. When they threatened to shoot him, he cackled, climbed down in seconds, and disappeared into the pines. That was the last anyone heard of him. Long story, but disturbing as hell. Story bestående des for. Last year, I felt like going for a run at night because the park near where I live looks really nice with the lights on. About 5 minutes into the run, I stopped to adjust my shoes because I'd forgotten to wear longer socks and they were rubbing my ankles. When I looked up, I saw a dark silhouette about 50 meters away, wearing a hoodie and running toward me at full speed. I was on the left side of the street, and he was on the right, so it was clear he was heading straight for me. I almost shit my pants as the adrenaline hit. I even started thinking about fighting him if he got any closer. Then, in the blink of an eye, the person tripped, face planted onto the ground, and started crawling in my direction. That was enough for me. I took off. Edit. Some people mention the scene from Get Out. It was exactly like that, except he fell halfway through. Story 15. One time my buddies and I decided to go for a walk in the cemetery at night because it scared the crap out of one of my friends, and the rest of us are a-holes. We were roaming around when our scared friend started freaking out and said he saw some weird people. We thought he was just being paranoid. But when we looked, there were indeed 3 or 4 figures farther back in the cemetery wearing some kind of hooded cloaks. They were surrounding a large grave with an angel statue we had passed earlier. We all freaked out for a second until we saw the figures grouped together around the grave and one of them take a picture. We eventually decided they were probably in a local band that needed an edgy album cover. Story 16. I was driving home after an extremely late night at work. I lived in the middle of nowhere, and about a mile before I reached my house, a woman covered in blood jumped out of the woods into the middle of the road, screaming. I panicked and drove around her, then slammed on the brakes and went back to help. She told me her boyfriend had beaten her and was still chasing her through the woods. I got her into my car and called the police. They met us at the hospital because I told them there was no way I was waiting on the side of the road while he was still nearby. Story 17. I went on a mountain hike in Transylvania with a group of friends from school. Far up the trail, after maybe 12 to 14 kilometers of trekking, we saw a house in the middle of nowhere. It had a barn with a few animals, a couple of cows, chickens, and the like. As we got closer, we saw several people, a man and 5 or 6 women, though there may have been more inside. The man came out to greet us, barely speaking the language. We struggled to understand him. They lived without electricity, gas, or anything like that. This was in the early 1990s, so there was no internet or mobile phones to think about, at least for most people. They all looked strange, with blank, almost dull expressions, and communication was difficult on both sides. They asked us who the president was and offered us some milk. They stared at our clothes and shoes with obvious curiosity, as if they had not seen other people in a long time. Or maybe there were others like them scattered around those mountains. I still do not know. To this day, I am not sure what was going on. It was not typical for the region, and we started to panic, especially since the man seemed somewhat disturbed and we were young. We kept looking around, wondering if there were more of them nearby, assuming there had to be a village close. What felt especially unsettling was that all the women stayed at a distance and never came close to us. It felt as if he was guarding them, or watching us to decide whether it was safe. One of my friends kept repeating that we did not want their milk and that we needed to leave because it was getting dark. We walked calmly for a while, and once we thought we were out of sight, we ran as fast as we could. A few hours later, we made camp, and all night we took turns keeping watch. When we later told people in the nearby villages about the mountain people, they did not believe us. They insisted that no one lived up there in the mountains. Story 18. A little over 18 years ago, I had just gotten out of the military. I drove all the way from Louisiana to my hometown in Montana without incident. I spent a few days at home, then got back on the road because my new destination was Boise, Idaho. It was February, so instead of driving straight down the length of the state, I cut across the Idaho Panhandle into Washington. The highway that runs straight through the state is very twisty and dangerous in winter. I crossed the state line into Washington on a Sunday, very early in the morning. As cliché as it sounds, there was a heavy fog in the air. After driving for a while, I really had to use the bathroom. Normally, being in the middle of nowhere, I would have just pulled over, but because of the fog and poor visibility, I decided it was safer to wait until I reached the next small town. After maybe 5 more miles, I started seeing signs for a town. I cannot remember the name for the life of me, but I think it was Linden or Linder, something like that. It was off Interstate 90, heading into the Spokane Valley. I took the right turn off the interstate and drove a short distance into town. It was small, but that did not seem unusual to me, since I grew up in a small town in Montana. That is where things got strange. There was not a single person anywhere. There were cars and businesses, but no people at all. No one walking the streets, no logging trucks, nothing. Everything was completely still. I stopped at a gas station, one of those all-in-one places that also does repairs and tires, but no one was at the counter. I figured it was just very early. I walked around the side to check the bathroom, but it was locked. As I walked back toward the front of the building, I noticed a delivery truck parked in the middle of the street. It was a Coca-Cola Classic truck. Its headlights were on, the hazard lights were flashing, and both the driver and passenger doors were wide open. It was just sitting there. At that point, I got a very bad feeling. I got back into my car and drove back the way I came. When I reached Interstate 90 again, I thought about stopping on the side of the road, but I was honestly too afraid. I kept driving until I reached Spokane. By then, I was more than a little shaken and had completely forgotten about needing to use the bathroom. I did not see or hear anything overtly creepy, but the stillness and total lack of life, human or animal, was deeply unsettling. Once I got to Spokane, I pulled out my Rand McNally map. This was before phone GPS was a thing, and tried to find the town. I could not find it anywhere. Even now, when I look on Google Maps, I cannot find anything named Linden, Linder, or anything similar. I will never forget that feeling of displacement I experienced there. When I got to Boise, I told a friend about it. He thought I was just ripping off Silent Hill or Resident Evil, and honestly, I cannot blame him. Still, that experience is exactly why I did not stop on the side of the road. I kept thinking about the part in Resident Evil 1 where the hikers are killed by the dogs. If you made it this far, thanks for reading. If you know of a town on Interstate 90 between Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and Spokane, Washington, let me know. And if you are from there, no offense, but your town is creepy as hell. Edit. After reviewing my trip, I realized I was mistaken. I did not stay on Highway 2. I actually got onto Interstate 90 and then continued toward Spokane. Lately, I have been thinking about this again, and I have a 3-day weekend coming up. I might take a road trip through northern Idaho to see if I can find this place again. Maybe I am tempting fate, but it will be my 37th birthday, so here is to adventure. Story 19. I am not sure if this is the kind of story you are looking for, but it is a fun one to tell, so here it is. I used to work in low-income home weatherization, basically giving free help to lower electricity and gas bills and make homes more comfortable for people who really needed it. That meant installing doors, insulation, and similar upgrades. One step in qualifying a home is testing combustion appliances to make sure they are not emitting carbon monoxide into the living space. If they are, and we seal up the house, we could kill the entire family. During a pre-inspection of a home on the outskirts of the city, I asked to see the homeowner's water heater. He told me it was in the basement, which is fairly normal, and I explained that I needed to inspect it before work could start. He went into the kitchen and began moving the refrigerator. It turned out the basement entrance was hidden under carpeting beneath the fridge. I should note that I inspected thousands of homes over the years and had never seen anything like that. Still, the job needed to be done. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it down the stairs, partly to check the layout, but mostly to look for black widow spiders, because absolutely not. That is when I noticed a dead cat, mostly reduced to a skeleton. Not pleasant, but honestly pretty common in crawl spaces and basements. I took a few steps down and continued checking for spiders, and then noticed a couple more small animal skeletons. At that point, I started to worry about gas, poison, or something equally dangerous and looked more closely. There were animal skeletons everywhere, at least 10 from a quick glance. Some were so degraded I could not even tell what they had been. I also noticed the homeowner standing at the entrance, very quietly with his hand on the door. Something clicked in my brain, and I was hit with an overwhelming sense of danger. I was about 4 steps away from the doorway being clear enough to close. I had no partner with me. There was death all around me, and I suddenly realized just how well hidden that basement entrance really was. I got out immediately. I told the guy I needed extra tools and would be back, then marked the job as non-feasible for health and safety reasons as I drove away. I have no idea whether I was actually in danger. It could have been completely innocent. Still, I remember the adrenaline rush and the sense of doom very clearly, and sometimes you just do not take chances. Edit. I am often asked whether I reported this to the police, especially because of the dead animals. I did not file a formal report, mainly because nothing I saw was entirely out of the ordinary. Crawl spaces and basements usually have vents near the base of the house, and it is very common for animals to get in and then be unable to get back out. If there is space under your house, there is a decent chance something has died there. You get used to it when your job regularly takes you into those spaces. That said, this was an extreme case, and everything together was concerning enough for me to leave immediately. The sad reality of working with low-income families is seeing how hard their lives can be. You learn not to do anything that might make things worse. I took pride in knowing my job made their lives just a little better, and I did not feel that being scared for a moment was enough reason to involve the police. Story 20. A friend and I decided to take our 4x4s and go camping in the mountains. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I put on my headlamp and walked a bit away from camp. As I was doing my business, I heard rocks shifting behind me, like something was walking around. My anxiety spiked. I finished up and turned around, and as my headlamp faintly lit the area, all I could see were eyes, about 20 of them, just staring at me. My breathing stopped, and I froze where I stood. Then I heard a long "maa" like a goat bleating. It turned out to be a herd of mountain goats, apparently intrigued by the strange ape in their backyard. I almost had an aneurysm. Story 21. This is probably less scary than a lot of other posts, but I was pretty sure I was going to be the nameless victim at the start of a horror movie, the one that shows just how dangerous the monster is. My dad and I were walking through the woods when we came across a young moose leg lying on the ground. It looked like it had been violently torn off, with no sign of the rest of the moose anywhere. It was fresh, with blood still on the wound, probably no more than a couple of hours old. My dad is a pretty skilled hunter, so he handed me his axe that he was carrying and told me to watch for wolves while he started looking for tracks. After a little while, he came back saying, "That's weird. Normally, if it were wolves, you'd be able to find paw prints, but I can't see any. Also no bear prints, so I have no idea what killed this." I asked, "So you didn't find any tracks at all?" His very reassuring response was, "Well, I did find what appears to be the mama moose tracks headed this way," showing me the prints. "You can see how her stride is a lot longer here. Whatever killed her baby, she didn't want to fight it. She just took off running." He then pulled out his bear spray and held it at the ready as we kept walking deeper into the woods, armed with bear spray and an axe, following an unknown predator that hadn't left any tracks. Story 22. My boyfriend and I were walking through the woods on a nature trail when we came across a piece of an alligator's tail and foot that had been ripped off, with the rest of the body gone. I freaked out. All I could think was, I have no idea what's big enough to kill and eat an entire alligator, but I do not want to meet it. We cautiously kept walking, and a few hundred feet later, we saw a giant, all at least 10 feet long, alligator walking along the shoreline, with a smaller, dead alligator in its mouth. And that was the day I learned that alligators were cannibals. Story 23. In a patch of trees near a field where I keep my horse, there's one of those big oil drums sealed with a very heavy boulder on top. The only way it could have gotten there is if it was placed by a tractor or some kind of heavy lifting equipment. My partner and I tried to push it off, but we had no luck. I don't know why, but it creeps me out every time I see it. I regularly walk my dogs past it to see if they show any interest, but after watching them search for a toy that was clearly in my lap, I'm not sure I have much faith in them anymore. Update: Y'all made me realize it could be something a bit creepier than I first thought, so I've reported it to 101. The officer I spoke to didn't sound particularly interested, but at least I know it's out of my hands, and I don't have to live with guilt if something is found. I had intended to go up there myself yesterday to have a look, but a pretty brutal physio session left me almost completely incapacitated for the day. I'm heading up tonight after work, so hopefully, if the police haven't been there before me, I might still be able to take some pictures for everyone. I thought my better half had taken a photo of it before, but I can't seem to find it on her phone. Anyway, thanks again, guys, for putting the fear in me and making me do the right thing. Story 24. My friend and I were hanging out in the woods one day back in high school when we saw a dog walking by, followed shortly by a kid. He looked troubled, so we asked if he needed help. He said he was dog sitting for a friend and the dog had gotten loose. We spent a good hour following the kid and the dog, going deeper and deeper into the woods. Eventually, I managed to get the dog to come to me, but it wasn't wearing a collar, so I couldn't grab it. My friend and I looked away for just a few seconds to discuss what to do next. When we turned back around, both the boy and the dog were gone. It was like they had completely vanished. It was autumn, so any footsteps should have been easy to hear from far away, but there was nothing. Just silence. No sign of them anywhere. I still don't really know what happened. Maybe they ran off really fast. Who knows? It was definitely enough to creep us out, though. Story 25. To get home from a popular kebab restaurant, I have to walk a short path through the woods. Along the way there is an extremely old, partially collapsed chapel, and occasionally I'll stop for a few seconds to admire it. It's quite beautiful in its own way. One winter day, I decided to rest there for a minute. I placed my kebab on the bench next to the chapel and stood there taking in the scenery. It was already rather dark, and the woods were almost completely silent. Just as I was about to continue my walk, I heard footsteps rapidly approaching. It was a child running toward me, and as soon as it saw me, it started repeatedly screaming, "Run! He is coming!" or variations of the same. I was a bit perplexed, so I watched the child run past me without moving. It didn't take another second for a much heavier pair of footsteps to appear. I could make out a silhouette in the distance, which seemed to be the source, and at that moment, I got really scared. Instead of running, I decided to hide in the chapel next to the altar. After tripping over an old broken bench, I reached my hiding place. The footsteps grew louder and louder, but just as they reached the chapel, they suddenly stopped. About 15 seconds of complete silence passed before the words, "Oi! You frigging idiot left your kebab on the bench," broke the quiet. It turned out to be a resident from my street. His nephew was visiting, and he wanted to race him to the kebab stand. I don't know whether this is the right place to post this. Ultimately, it's more stupid than creepy. Story 26. This took place in the Australian bush around 10 or 11 at night. I was 17, leading a staggered column of about 60 cadets to our detachment campsite. Due to light discipline rules, only I at the very front of the group and the other flight commander at the rear had torches. This was so any vehicles coming along the trail could see us, and so most of the cadets could maintain their night vision. We were camouflaged and thus difficult to see at night. As we walked, I periodically glanced to my sides and kept seeing what looked like dewdrops on the ground, almost like tiny blue gems glinting in my torchlight on either side of the trail. I had to maintain my position in formation, so I couldn't get a good look at what they were. After a while, we stopped for a very brief break, and I took the opportunity to look closer. Walking over to the side of the trail, I spotted a small cluster of the diamonds and focused my head torch on them. Rather than seeing diamonds or dewdrops or anything pleasant, I saw a group of about 5 large spiders crouching in the leaf litter, staring at me. They looked like huntsmen's, about the size of an adult's hand. Sweeping my head around, I realized there were thousands of them, all over the ground, some on tree trunks, everywhere around me, glaring at the light on my head. I had a very brisk walk back to the formation and tried to play it cool while screaming in my head. Being a massive arachnophobe, I have no clue how I managed to set up a tent and spend the next week in that cursed forest. Story 27. I was a Boy Scout, camping with a group of older buddies and an adult leader in Yellowstone. We had been backpacking for 2 days and stopped in a beautiful little clearing at the bottom of some huge tree-covered hills. As the sun started to set, we made a fire, and I wandered off into the trees to dig a hole and fill it back up. You know what I mean. As I squatted there, Basking in the moonlight and appreciating the glow of the fire among the trees, I looked up toward a ridgeline a few hundred yards away where the moon was rising. I kid you not, I saw a damn big cougar crest the hill and just watch our fire. It probably wasn't a danger to me, but seeing that outline, the unmistakable shoulder crawl they do, was haunting. I watched it sit there for a good 15 minutes until my worried buddies called me back. When I finished up, I pointed the cat out to them. It was still there, just watching us. Crazy. Story 28. This happened in Auburn, Alabama, in 2008. It was Halloween, and my friends and I Googled haunted houses. I can't remember the website, or even if there really was one, but we found something about 45 minutes away. It didn't seem like a big attraction, and we figured it was probably on someone's land and more of a local thing. We drove out there around 10 p.m. This was before iPhones and GPS, so we used MapQuest directions. We ended up on a long country road with no streetlights, then turned onto a legitimate dirt road that went through the woods. It was pitch black. We drove down it for about 10 minutes before seeing an old house with a handwritten sign by the driveway that said, "Haunted House." There were no other cars, no lights, and no people anywhere. We pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, basically saying, "All right, this is messed up. We should leave." Suddenly, an old pickup truck turned on about 15 feet in front of us, facing us, with its headlights shining straight into our faces. It started driving toward us down the driveway. We backed out and took off. The truck followed us, almost bumping our rear end, right on our tail down that pitch-black dirt road in the middle of the Alabama woods. We were losing our minds. It felt like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes. The truck stayed on us, blinding us with its headlights and nearly hitting us, all the way back until we got off at our exit. Only then did it finally turn away. We never saw who was driving. I still think about what might have happened if we'd gotten out of the car in that driveway. Story 29. Back when I was about 11, my friend and I were walking through the woods because he said he had something to show me. We followed the path for a good 20 minutes until he suddenly started weaving through some closely planted thin trees. Despite my confusion, I followed him until he stopped in a clearing. There, in front of us, was a round mud hut. He said he was too scared to go inside, so I went in instead. The floor was sunken, and a small fire burned in the center, surrounded by makeshift wooden benches. That was strange enough, but the real showstopper was the walls. Every inch of the mud walls was covered in animal skulls held up by wire, ranging from tiny sparrow skulls to a deer skull. It was a striking sight. Outside the hut, there was another small bench with the phrase, "Where heaven and earth meet," carved into it. Fast forward to January of this year. My mom and I tried to find the hut again. We did come across it, but it had been demolished, and all but a few of the skulls were gone. It looked like someone had jumped on top of it after taking the skulls. What I can only imagine was for some kind of vulture culture collection. It's kind of sad it was gone, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. Edit. I saw a comment suggesting this might have been for a film shoot, but I think that's very unlikely. The fen had been there for multiple years, and it clearly took a long time to find and attach all the skulls. There's only one small primary school in the area, so this was hardly anyone's project. Story 30. I've told this story before, and it will probably stick with me until my deathbed. I was a high schooler in the mid-90s, fishing off the coast of Corpus Christi with my uncle and cousins. We were about 18 miles out and had been on the water all day. It was around 8 p.m., and we were getting ready to head back in. This was before daylight saving time, so the sun was already setting and it was getting dark. I was at the stern, bringing in the traps, when I saw a glow about 100 to 150 feet away. It was nothing I had ever seen before. The best way I can describe it is like if you stuck a toaster underwater and the orange heating elements were still glowing. But even that doesn't quite capture it. It was very large. We were on a 38-foot boat, and I'd guess it was 5 to 6 times bigger, though it's hard to judge size on open water. The water above it wasn't churning, but you could tell it was being disturbed, almost like something was pushing the water upward. The whole time, I expected something to break the surface. I was completely frozen, like when you're walking at night and an animal suddenly runs out in front of you and everything just stops. Eventually, I called out to my uncle. He came over and stood right beside me. He didn't say anything, just stared, the same way I was. Then the thing, object, creature, whatever it was, just shot off toward the Gulf. Not gradually, not accelerating. It instantly vanished. All I said was, "You seen that before?" He replied, "Nope. Let's go." We didn't say another word on the way back in. When my cousins asked what happened, my uncle just said, "Nothing." I've spent the past 25 years thinking about what it could have been, especially once the internet became a thing. I've found a lot of people who've seen something very similar. There's a naval base down there, but no known submarine bases. For a long time, it consumed me. Because if we really have something like that, then we're sitting on technology that could change everything. Story 31. I was delivering a sailboat from San Diego to Morro Bay, California, roughly 25 miles offshore, alone. Around 1 a.m., about 36 hours into the trip, I saw a bright glowing blue orb about 30 feet in diameter just below the surface at my 1 o'clock. It was a moonless night, which made the blurry sphere stand out against the black water. My first thought was, oh crap, a fast attack submarine is surfacing, not uncommon in that area. I started desperately looking for a yellow flare in the water, the maritime warning for a soon-to-be surfacing sub, but couldn't find one. The orb fluctuated in size and moved very slowly, so I quickly abandoned the submarine theory. After a while, I idled the boat and put it into irons to just watch it. When it finally broke the surface in a large, bright, and loud boil, I realized what I had been seeing. It turned out to be a large school of sardines swimming together, agitating the bioluminescence present that night. It remains one of the most bizarre experiences I've had on the water, and I will never forget it. Story 32. I was camping a couple of years ago when I heard movement outside my tent. Thinking it was my friend, I called out to him, but there was no answer. After a minute, the movement stopped, so I left my tent and sat outside for a while. About 10 minutes later, the friend I thought had been outside came out of his tent looking for his phone. He denied being anywhere near my tent. It was only him, myself, and my girlfriend at the time, so I said it must have been an animal. That's when we both heard something move very close to us and saw the silhouette of a person watching us. Don't ask me why, but we both stood up and started approaching them. The person began to run, and we chased them for about a minute before giving up, when we noticed things dropping from their hands. Not only did they drop, my friend's phone that he couldn't find, but mine and my girlfriend's as well. The person had been in our tents. Story 33. When I was a kid, I lived on a tiny property in the woods. The house was built around what used to be stables. My bedroom had once been the hay storage area. Before getting to the creepy part, there are a few things worth mentioning. When you were in my room, you could sometimes smell hay out of nowhere. My dog always refused to go upstairs, like something up there terrified it. You could sometimes hear knocking on the doors. There were 3 entrance doors, and sometimes they would knock all at once. With that said, here's the unsettling part. My room had a huge window that looked out over the woods, and the garden was basically a clearing. One night I heard a child giggling from upstairs. I ran up there and found my window open, with something running out into the woods. I spent 2 more years in that house, and felt unsafe the entire time. Edit. For those who think kids were pranking me, I highly doubt any child would survive a fall from my room into the garden. It was private property, and the only entrance was a large gate that was very inconvenient to climb. Story 34. This is something that has always stuck with me. I was probably about 14 on a camping trip with my scout troop in the middle of nowhere. We had literally hiked about 40 miles into the woods and set up camp. There were no phones and no way to contact the outside world, just us and a few parents fishing and hiking. On the second night of the trip, my dad, 2 other parents, and I were sitting around the campfire and somehow got onto the subject of UFOs. We were talking about different stories we'd seen on TV. Right in the middle of one story, my friend's dad pointed up at the sky and said, "Holy crap, what's that?" We thought he was joking for a good minute, until he said, "Seriously, turn around, there's more." We finally turned, and saw 3 massive fireballs, truly massive, screaming down from the sky toward the earth. They looked like they were moving in slow motion, or maybe time just felt like it slowed down. But it took forever for them to disappear behind the tree line. Naturally, we were all completely freaked out and started speculating about what it could be, but there was no way to find out for at least 3 more days. The hike back out of the woods was the worst, just walking quietly and wondering what could be waiting for us, or what the world might be like if our worst fears had come true while we were out there. It turned out a Russian satellite had broken up and fallen to Earth that night, and it was seen for miles. Still, those were the creepiest 3 days of my life. Story 35. I was jogging at night with headphones on in a park filled with dense trees and bushes. The overgrowth was creeping onto the path, making it hard to see, so I turned on the flashlight on my phone. Ahead of me, I started to see what looked like a fire burning, but I couldn't really make it out since I take my glasses off when I jog. As I got closer, the path opened into a clearing, and I saw a huge fire raging with no one around. I paused for a moment and pulled out my glasses, only to realize there were actually 6 people standing there, perfectly spaced apart. All of them turned at the same time to look at me. I immediately did a 180 and sprinted the hell out of there. Edit. The path I jog on at night is usually well lit because the city of Winnipeg uses LED streetlights. The wooded area leads to a small spot called Don Gary Park, where there's a bench I use to sit and reflect on my day and my goals for tomorrow. The bench is right next to a police launch dock on the Red River, and I've never felt unsafe there. My friends and I later speculated that the 6 guys I saw were probably police officers blowing off steam on a quiet night. Story 36. When I was younger, I went elk hunting with my uncle and some of his friends and had an experience I'll never forget. One day, I went on a hunt with his buddy Tyler. Tyler got an elk down about 30 minutes before dark. We made our way over to it, and as we started cleaning it, we began hearing wolves howling in the distance, slowly getting closer. With each passing minute, the smell of death grew stronger, the sky darkened, and the wolves drew nearer. By now, it was fully dark. All I could see was what was directly in the beam of my mini maglite and Tyler's hat-bill light as he worked on the elk as fast as he could. I kept watch on the wolves. We were surrounded. I couldn't tell how many there were. It felt like dozens, though it was probably only a few. I could hear them running circles around us, yelping back and forth. Occasionally, I caught sight of one in the light before it vanished again. Every once in a while, one would get brave enough to dart within a few feet, trying to snatch a piece of the elk. Finally, the elk was cleaned, and we set up the scent circle around the carcass to keep it somewhat safe. All that was left was a 3-mile hike back to camp, completely covered in blood and being trailed by wolves. By far the most terrifying experience of my life. Edit. A few clarifications. First, for those saying it was coyotes and that wolves are rare, I live in Idaho and wolves are not rare. Look up the 1995 wolf reintroduction to the Frank Church Wilderness. They've since multiplied significantly. I'll try to find a dated map of all the packs in Idaho. Secondly, we didn't fully process the animal that night. We just gutted it so the innards wouldn't spoil, leaving it overnight. November at 10,000 feet is cold enough to keep bugs and bacteria away. The next morning, we returned with the whole camp of 8 guys to properly process it. Story 37. This isn't nearly as creepy as some of the other stories, but it stuck with me. One time I was hiking in a state park near my house with my boyfriend. The park was deserted, and we decided to stop by a small body of water hidden in the brush. There had been a lot of rain recently, creating a fairy-sized lake with a little waterfall feeding into it. It was really beautiful. As we stood there admiring it, I started to hear growling. At first I thought I was imagining it, so I kept listening. It sounded like a low, animalistic growl. I turned to my boyfriend and joked, "I hear growling," expecting him to brush it off. Instead, he said, "Me too." I spun around and quickly scanned the area, but it looked like we were completely alone. We moved on and kept hiking. I still don't know what that was about. Story 38. A few years ago, I delivered newspapers in a rural area. For the most part, it was a peaceful route. I'd drive a few miles, stop at a house, continue down the road for a few more miles, and repeat. I actually enjoyed it most of the time, except in winter when we had far too much snow. The only thing that truly unsettled me was the cougar. I could always tell on the nights it was out hunting. The large herds of deer and the flocks of turkeys would completely vanish. The birds would go silent, and all the usual nighttime sounds would disappear. If I stayed in one place too long, I'd start to panic. Nothing was creepier than the night I pulled over near some train tracks to grab something from my back seat. I didn't get out of the car, just twisted around in my seat. When I turned back, there was a very large cat staring at me through the front window. I might have taken off at about 80 miles per hour. The worst part came a couple of hours later, several miles away, as I was finishing my route. There was the cougar again, watching me from the trees. I'm still not sure which thought was more terrifying, that it had followed me, or that there might have been more than one. Story 39. My wife and I went camping for our anniversary one year near Payson, close to the rim. We went to bed, and it was eerie hearing nothing but the wind moving through the pines. I eventually fell asleep. I woke up with sleep paralysis and saw a red light glowing outside our tent. The light grew brighter, and something started unzipping the tent. I was frozen, staring at the flap as it slowly opened. When it was almost unzipped, I managed to move my head and look at my wife. She had a look of pure terror on her face, mouth open like she was about to scream. When she did scream, I woke up. There was nothing but the wind in the pines and complete darkness. The tent hadn't been opened, and we were still lying exactly where we had fallen asleep. Do I think it was a nightmare? Probably. I've always been terrified of aliens and stories about them, so maybe my brain was messing with me. Or maybe it was a repressed memory. Who knows? It scared the hell out of me, and we left the next day. Story 40. To set the scene, I was 11 years old. I was tent camping with my mom in Yellowstone National Park. My mom is absolutely terrified of bears. We set up our tent, had dinner, and went to bed. Not long after, we heard gunshots in the distance, which were apparently meant to scare off wildlife nearby. That didn't sit well with my mom, but we both eventually fell asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up to my mom whispering, "Wake up, there's a bear. I can hear a bear growling outside. There's a bear. Oh my God, bear." I was an 11-year-old girl, and definitely not capable of fighting off a bear, so I tried to tell her to calm down and be quiet. She wasn't having it. Then I heard a growly, grumbly, rustling sound outside the tent, but it didn't sound quite like what I imagined a bear would sound like. My mom kept panicking, convinced we were about to be eaten. After a few more growls, we suddenly heard a voice from outside say, "Honey, shut the F up, roll over, you're too loud." It turned out my mom's bear was just the husband in the next tent over, snoring loudly. Story 41. My girlfriend and I were traveling through the Australian outback, literally in the middle of the desert. We pulled over at a random spot along the road to roll out the swag and sleep before continuing on, since you can't drive at night out there. I woke up to a man standing over the swag. We absolutely panicked. Long story short, he was a French backpacker whose car had broken down. He had no reception and had run out of food and water the day before. For some reason, he had hidden his car in the shrubs. He spoke very little English, but my girlfriend at the time was also a backpacker from Europe and spoke French, so she was able to understand his story. His car, a Ford Festiva that clearly wasn't made for the outback, had been broken down for days. We gave him a 20-liter jerry can of water and a bunch of canned food. He refused to leave his car, even after we explained there was no way it was going anywhere. We drove until we got reception and called the local police, telling them exactly what had happened. We also told them how far we had driven from where we left him, checking the speedometer before we left, and again when we got reception, so they could figure out his location. We gave all our details to the police, but never heard back. We hoped he was okay, and assumed no news was good news. Still, I'll never forget the feeling of waking up to a man standing over my swag in the middle of the desert. Story 42. Okay, a bit of backstory. On the Navajo reservation, not far from where this happened, it's said that coyotes are messengers between our world and the next. On the day of my birth father's funeral, we were all back at my parents' house with my siblings and extended family. At one point, my stepdad pointed out a coyote standing in the road. It's really rare to see them out during the day, especially alone like that. It stood there in the middle of the road and looked straight through the large windows at all of us for about 5 seconds before lazily walking up the road. I don't know if it felt creepy at the time, but it was definitely a strange experience. Story 43. I was on a canoe trip down the Shenandoah River with my wife. The only public property on the river is the islands, so that's where people camp on multi-day trips. Around dusk, we came across 2 women using a machete to hack through the brush on an island to set up camp. My wife and I decided the island would be a good place to stop as well. We paddled about half a mile down the island and set up camp near the riverbank. Later, we were woken by the sound of a machete cutting through the brush and the 2 women screaming, laughing maniacally, and shouting that they were going to find and kill us. I didn't sleep much that night. Story 44. Not exactly the kind of creepy you might expect, but I found it just as strange. There's a local forest near my college, and my buddies and I would go there often to camp and hang out. One time, we were trekking through the woods toward our usual spot when we heard a lot of howling and barking. It didn't sound like any normal coyote or other wild dog. Being dumb college kids, we decided to investigate. We saw a bright light in the distance and kept moving closer until we found something I'll never forget. On all fours, circling and playing with each other, was a group of about 20 furries, all fully dressed in their costumes. They were barking and doing what I can only describe as furry things. My friends and I couldn't help but laugh awkwardly. We left without them ever knowing we were there, but that night is definitely unforgettable. Story 45. I was hunting about 3 years ago in the South Texas Hill Country. I went out around 5:30 in the morning so I could get to the blind before the feeder went off. While walking through a large grove of pecan trees, I got the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped, looked around, and loaded my .223, knowing that whatever was watching me wasn't friendly. I waited for about 5 minutes in some bushes before I saw the largest mountain lion I've ever seen jump down from a tree. It easily outweighed me by about 80 pounds and scared me out of my mind. I quietly slipped out of its sight, booked it back to the house, and didn't go hunting for the rest of the trip. Story 46. While backpacking in the woods, we came across a ranger on horseback. He asked if we had seen anyone nearby, but we hadn't. He had been checking a spot about 100 yards from us, where someone had left a bunch of gear several weeks earlier. We walked over and found a campsite that had been hastily abandoned. The fire had burned out, but a cooking pot and kettle were still over it, along with dishes and sitting pads neatly arranged as if a couple were about to eat. The food had been torn into and scattered by wild animals, which wasn't surprising. The tent, however, was partially collapsed with a broken pole, and the door was unzipped and fluttering in the wind, revealing full backpacks, sleeping pads, and sleeping bags. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dirt. Story 47. We live in Kentucky. It's not rural by any means, but there's still woodland almost everywhere. I was about 12 years old in the 7th grade. It was fall, and I was sitting outside waiting at my bus stop, which was about 3 or 4 houses down from ours. My mother was sitting on our front porch, smoking a cigarette, when she pointed across the street. We saw a woman walking out of the tree line. She had waist-length hair and was wearing a long white, possibly gray nightgown. Neither of us thought much of it. There was a nursing home less than a block from our house, so we assumed she was a patient who had wandered off or gotten lost. We watched as the woman paced back and forth, walking in circles, until she finally sat down at the base of a tree. Suddenly, it looked as if an invisible lasso had been thrown around her. She was yanked from the waist up into the trunk and then toward the top of the tree, and she was never seen again. My bus eventually came, and my mom called the police. They never found her, or any signs of a struggle, or anything at all. Nobody ever believes me when I tell this story, and if my mother hadn't been there, I wouldn't believe it myself. Either way, I never went to that bus stop alone again. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen that I still can't rationalize. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.